The committee shall come to order. We are meeting today to consider 6 bills and 1 committee resolution. All have been properly noticed and circulated. There are copies available on each side of the dais, along with copies of timely filed amendments. Late amendments have been circulated electronically and will be distributed to the members present at the dais. Pursuant to committee rules, other members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend their remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. And pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further procedures today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote for or the ayes and nays have been ordered. I'll begin, right? The item for consideration is H.R. 5316, offered by Representative Cox. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now will recognize Representative Cox to speak on the legislation. Mr. Cox, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including this bill in today's markup and for the opportunity to speak in support of my bill. The Move Water Now Act, H.R. 5316, would authorize $200 million for repair and conveyance facilities impacted by land subsidence and prioritizes facilities that have lost 50% or more of its carrying capacity. The bill would also authorize an equivalent amount for the restoration goal of the San Joaquin River settlement. Rather than sending increasingly larger flows down the river channel, this funding would support projects that restore and enhance habitat for salmon while providing water supply reliability for water users. The Frank-Kern Canal runs 152 miles from Friant Dam south to the Kern River, delivering surface water supply from the San Joaquin River to the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. Completed in 1951, the canal provides water for irrigation for over 1 million acres of farmland and potable uses for over 250,000 rural Californians. Land subsidence have impacted the canal's carrying capacity by 60%, with many of the most impacted farms and communities located in my district. My legislation would provide non-reimbursable funding for repairs for critical conveyance facilities like Frank-Kern. As we've heard during the hearing for this bill, the WIN Act does not provide concrete certainty on reimbursable versus non-reimbursable costs for repairing the Frank-Kern. H.R. 5316 would provide the certainty by clearly stating that the federal share, up to 50%, is non-reimbursable. There is a local cost share partner ready to cover half of the cost to repair this federally owned facility. Congress has already demonstrated its support for fixing the canal. In the December funding bill, Congress appropriated $2.3 million for a Frank-Kern Canal feasibility study and $20 million for, quote, for the repair of critical reclamation canals where operational conveyance has been seriously impacted by factors such as age or land subsidence, unquote. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has stated, quote, repairing subsidence on the Frank-Kern Canal is one of my top priorities. I'm also pleased to see that the Trump administration supports repairs, allocating $11 million for the Frank-Kern Canal capacity correction and repairs in its recently announced distribution of additional funding for fiscal year 2020. Restoring carrying capacity along the Frank-Kern will improve surface water deliveries and is important for groundwater recharge efforts. The region has significant groundwater recharge potential, but it can only be fully realized if the infrastructure exists to deliver surface water when available flows are in the system. The impacts of land subsidence on the Frank-Kern Canal are most visually evident when passing bridges across the canal. The water is lapping right up against these bridges. There's no clearance now, where in the past the same flow capacity could easily pass underneath the bridge. Last spring, I hosted Chairman Grijalva on a visit to my district and showed him the situation firsthand, and he agreed that something had to be done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your support of this important bill. I'd also like to thank Congressman Jim Costa, Congressman John Garamendi, and Congressman Josh Harder for co-sponsoring this legislation. A vote for H.R. 5316 is a vote for California agriculture. to vote for healthy groundwater basins and a vote for rural communities. I urge you all to support the Move Water Now Act, and I would implore you, let's not let knee-jerk partisanship get in the way of a project with bipartisan support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield the rest of my time.
And before we consider the amendments, any members, I think Mr. McClintock wished to be recognized. Mr. McClintock, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For many years, the Central Valley suffered from groundwater overdrafts, and in response, using the beneficiary pays principle, the federal government fronted the money for the Central Valley project to use surplus water in wet years to recharge the aquifers. The users of the water have since entirely paid off the project, and it worked until so-called environmental laws in the 1970s set in motion severe restrictions in the ability of the project to deliver water. The result, groundwater overdrafts returned, and we now have created significant subsidence, which in turn has further reduced the ability of the project to deliver water for replenishment. The aqueducts are largely gravity-fed, which means that just a little subsidence can dramatically reduce water flow. The WIN Act, passed with a bipartisan majority in both houses and signed by President Obama in 2016, addressed the need to re-engineer the aqueducts, for which $2.3 million has already been appropriated. Meanwhile, President Trump has brought some sanity to the abuse of biological opinions that caused the damage in the first place, as well as ordering critical updates to the ESA, NEPA, and WOTUS. But the WIN Act will soon expire, and we're beginning to despair the majority has any intention to reauthorize it so that this work can continue. Instead, they've chosen proposals such as this bill, which does nothing but throw taxpayer money at a problem with no intentions of addressing the root causes. Now, there are two ways to restore the capacity of the Bryant-Kern Canal. One is to earmark money for the repairs paid by taxpayers who get no benefit from the project. The other is to reauthorize the WIN Act so the engineering work already underway can be completed and then proceed under the beneficiary pays principle, assuring the project's ultimately paid by the users of the water. I am also deeply concerned with provisions in H.R. 5316 that would earmark $200 million for the San Joaquin River Settlement Fund. This does nothing to deliver more water for the San Joaquin Valley. It's rather an environmental slush fund that works against water delivery in the valley. Cole Upton, a longtime San Joaquin Valley farmer, I think very aptly described the settlement this way. He writes, "The environmentalists got what they demanded in court, a fishery that costs the most money and requires the most water. The option of a lesser fishery having less effect on the Bryant service area was rejected. However, as part of the settlement, environmentalists promised to help mitigate the water losses to the area. Instead, they filed lawsuit after lawsuit over Delta issues that have had the effect of seriously compromising any program to get our water back. The result will be the ultimate loss of 200,000 to 300,000 acres of fertile farmland, plus the expected detrimental effect on the communities in the Bryant service area. We will see the same effect visited on our area as happened on the west side of the valley following the passage of the Central Valley Project Improvement Act in 1992." End quote. That's what we're throwing $200 million of American taxpayer money into. We don't need to put another $200 million into that fiasco. With this provision, $200 million goes to canal repairs to improve river flow, and $200 million goes to assuring that the least amount of water actually reaches farmers. That's called bait and switch. Here's what I suggest instead. Reauthorize the WIN Act that's already funding the engineering study for the canal before it expires next year. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Costa, you're recognized.
Yes, I want to thank Mr. Chairman for this hearing. I think we've got some important legislation today. I want to, as a original co-sponsor of Mr. Cox's legislation 5316, commend him for his efforts, his hard work to help provide solutions to the needs for water for our valley. Clearly, not only are farmers who are facing the issue of overdraft and subsidence, but our farm communities that are also dependent upon a potable water supply need this support. Having been involved in this issue, these related issues in the valley for over 30 years, I guess it's easy to maybe make distinctions between, black and white perspectives in how you solve problems. What I've learned is you got to work with everybody. What I've learned is that from people's perspective, these are shades of gray in terms of how we come to solutions that use all the water tools in our water toolbox, employing both local, state, and federal resources. I'm not going to take the members of the committee through song and verse of all the different challenges we faced and the different alignments of litigation that has taken place between water users, between our farm communities, and the environmental community. It would take too long. But I want to thank Chairman Gravaglia for coming to the Valley last year to take a perspective, a fresh look from outside of California, both the water challenges that we face on the east side and the west side, and trying to fix what is a broken water system in California. Broken in the sense that in 1951, when the Friant Kern Canal was built, it cost $61 million. $61 million. It's been paid for. It has served a multitude of needs. But like a lot of our projects, not only in California, but around the country, they get 50 years old, they get 60 years old, and they need maintenance and they need update. And this is, the fix on this is now $300 to $500 million. So a lot more than the cost of the original canal. But on the west side, we have similar projects that Congressman Cox is supporting our efforts on with the Delta Mendota Canal, the California Aqueduct, that not only serves the Central Valley, but it provides water to Southern California for urban use. And so I tend to look at it, and by the way, I was one of the original promoters of the WIN Act, and Congressman McClintock, I'm intending to do everything I can to get the reauthorization of the WIN Act. But I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. We need to have bipartisan support for the reauthorization of the WIN Act, just as we did for the creation of the WIN Act, and working with Senator Feinstein in that effort. So we've got to use all the water tools in our water toolbox to solve these challenges that we face. Let me add one other thing that I think that's very important. For our environmental friends out there who deride adding to our water supply, support for this thing ought to be something that you just do because it's the right thing to do. The amount of water we lose each year because we lack the capacity to move it puts demands and strains not only on subsidence and overdraft, but also puts, if you think about it this way, it's another way to use a water tool. On the Delta Mendota Canal, we're losing 20% capacity. You know what that adds up to on last year? 80,000 acre-feet of water. 80,000 acre-feet of water that we lost last year because we couldn't move it. That's the size of a significant reservoir that we're trying to get authorized on the west side. So this is under the idea of good public policy, conserving water that already is allocated to be moved through these canals to get to where the people need it, our farm communities, our farm workers, the people that live and work on those farms, and the farmers, ranchers, dairymen, and women who depend upon this valuable, valuable supply to put food on America's dinner table every night. That's what we're talking about here. It's food security. So we can talk about what's the best way, this way or that way. Let's solve some problems. And I, for that reason, urge that we support this legislation. Food is a national security issue. Where water flows, food grows. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation.
Yields, any further discussion on the legislation before we begin the amendment process? Are there any amendments? If there are no amendments, the question is on adopting the bill and ordering favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. A roll call has been requested, and the vote will be postponed pursuant to prior instructions. Next, the item for consideration now is H.R. 5347, offered by Representative Cox. I ask unanimous consent, Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize Representative Cox to speak on his legislation. Mr. Cox.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for considering the second of my two bills I've sponsored at today's markup. I appreciate the opportunity to again speak in support of my legislation, this time on the Disadvantaged Community Drinking Water Assistance Act. H.R. 5347 would create a grant program authorizing $100 million for projects located in income-qualified communities of less than 60,000 that bring drinking water up to federal standards. The grant program is intended to be only for reclamation states, and I'll be offering a technical amendment today to clarify this in the bill. My district is located in California's Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, home to some of our nation's most dire problems when it comes to drinking water. According to the Public Policy Institute of California, nearly half of California's failing water systems are in the San Joaquin Valley. H.R. 5347 seeks to fix that. We've got some leadership at the state level, and they're taking the problem seriously. And last year, California committed $130 million annually for the next 10 years to address these problems. California is not alone. These drinking water challenges are occurring in small rural communities across the West, and it's time for the federal government to do its part. Existing programs at the USDA and EPA have population caps that leave out communities in my district. Take the city of Wasco, which at 27,000 people does not qualify for EPA's assistance for small and disadvantaged communities drinking water grants. Under my bill, Wasco would qualify for a grant to address nitrate and 123 TCP contamination in its water supply. And before I continue, I ask unanimous consent to submit, for the record, a letter of support from the city of Wasco in support of H.R. 5347.
Without objection.
We've also heard about the city of Delano in our hearing last month. Delano has already implemented several rate increases to pay for contamination remediation. The city's residents, however, cannot afford more federal loans, and at 50,000 people, the community is again too large to qualify for federal grant programs for rural systems. Meanwhile, Delano still has nitrate contamination issues. And programs at other agencies do not do enough to assist struggling communities in the arid western United States. My bill seeks to close these gaps. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, as the main federal water supply agency in the West, is most knowledgeable on Western water supply challenges. The agency has over a half a century of experience and expertise and is well equipped to solve drinking water problems in the Western United States. Even a community that qualifies for an existing program may not have the resources to cover technical assistance or other costs associated with federal grant applications. When the most economical solution is to combine water systems, this should be encouraged. Consolidating several community water systems or connecting a small system to a large system to achieve economies of scale will reduce cost burdens and bring clean water to more Americans. H.R. 5347 recognizes these wide and various challenges by making these solutions eligible for grant funding proposed under this legislation. I want to again thank my fellow Californians and committee members, Congressman Costa and Congressman Huffman, for co-sponsoring this legislation, as well as my fellow Central Valley colleague, Congressman Josh Harder. On behalf of those in California's 21st Congressional District that turn on their taps and can't always count on clean water to run, I urge you to support my Disadvantaged Community Drinking Water Assistance Act. And thank you, and I'll yield the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields. Before any amendment discussion, any other member wish to be recognized? Mr. McClintock, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is one of a spate of bills coming out of the Water Subcommittee that triumphantly enacts shiny new programs to accomplish what is already being accomplished by existing programs. In this case, it creates a new, expensive, nationwide grant program under the Department of Interior for disadvantaged communities that have experienced a significant decline in quality or quantity of drinking water. We already have that program. It's called the Assistance for Small and Disadvantaged Communities Drinking Water Grant Program. It's established by the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. Let me read you exactly what that program does according to the EPA. It awards grants to states to assist underserved, small, and disadvantaged communities that are unable to finance activities needed to provide safe drinking water. To assist small and disadvantaged communities with improving their drinking water resources, this program will include approximately $42.8 million in funding. Grants will be awarded as non-competitive grants to states with a 2% tribal allotment of $875,000. The grant program is designed to help public water systems in underserved communities meet and comply with SDWA requirements. The grant program will provide assistance to underserved communities that have no household drinking water or wastewater services or are served by a public water system that violates or exceeds any maximum containment level, treatment technique, or action level. So what is the point of this bill except a self-congratulatory press release? If the population caps are a problem, why don't we just adjust the population caps rather than create a whole new bureaucracy? The EPA is the agency that is directly responsive for safe drinking water. It is the agency that sets the standards and enforces safe drinking laws, and it is the agency that is best positioned to determine community needs and to implement this objective, which is why Congress placed this program under its auspices. This bill sets up a parallel program under the Department of Interior for exactly the same purpose. If the existing program's not working, we should either change it or scrap it. As I said, if Mr. Cox has a problem with the population caps, why not simply adjust the population caps? But please, let's not pile one bureaucracy on top of another. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a principal co-author of this legislation, let me make a few observations, and that is that we have communities not only in the San Joaquin Valley but throughout the country that are unincorporated, that don't meet clean drinking water standards, that need support. And I view this legislation as a work in progress. Clearly, adjustments could be made, as Congressman McClintock is suggesting, in the existing EPA program, and we should have that conversation. But I think what Congressman Cox is attempting to do is to deal with the real problem that exists not only in California, but throughout many communities in our country that don't meet clean drinking water standards, and the people that live in those communities, whether it be an incorporated area, or it's harder when you're in a non-incorporated area because you have far less resources to deal with the needs to update the water systems. And many of the water systems are old, were built decades, and in some cases a century ago. And so therein lies the challenge. The existing program within the EPA has good intentions, but it falls short. And maybe we need to figure out a way to get the Department of Interior with the EPA to work together on addressing those shortcomings to deal with the needs of today. I do know this, and the governor made a good point in California last year, shortly after he took office. He met together with his cabinet folks on a Saturday in Sacramento. They thought they were going to meet in the cabinet room. He took them in a van to a community an hour south of Sacramento. This community was unincorporated, had several thousand people, but it didn't meet state or federal clean drinking water standards. And he observed if you have a community that the people don't get clean drinking water to meet their needs, the likelihood is their housing is substandard. The likelihood is that their schools are not achieving average or above average grades, and the community suffers. In the richest country in the world, where regardless of where you live, in a small town or whether you live in an unincorporated area where you have 1,000 hookups or more, we need to do a better job to address the fact that every citizen have clean drinking water that meets both state and federal standards. And that's the whole intent of this legislation, to provide another tool to assist these communities. I will continue to pledge to take some of the good ideas that Congressman McClintock talked about and working with the existing program. I know Congressman Cox is interested in taking advantage of all the opportunities that are out there and ways in which we can work together to combine resources. We don't want to waste federal taxpayer dollars. Nobody wants to do that. So we got to figure out a better way to deal with the needs of these communities, not just in the San Joaquin Valley, but throughout our country, because the need is there. I urge that you support this legislation, and let's continue to work on this effort to make sure that we address the needs, drinking water quality needs of all Americans. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields, and I recognize myself to a brief comment on the visit that that Representative Cox arranged. Obviously, the first piece of legislation deals with an infrastructure issue that is grave and needs to be dealt with, and the issues of subsidence and the need for replenishment and having more water availability is critical, and that deals with that. I think the second piece of legislation, which is being seen under the purview of this committee and not Energy and Commerce, is to address a very important issue. As we visited the communities that we did, that were affected by the population threshold set by EPA in terms of clean drinking water, that were not eligible to access either funding or technical assistance to deal with those issues. You talk to the people there and the families there and the schools there and the leadership in those communities, and time again, the issue was clean, safe, reliable, potable water for the residents of it. And who are these residents? Young population, a lot of kids, farm worker population that work in the fields and harvest, the harvests that come to us on our tables every day. Who are these people? These people are hardworking people that don't have all the necessary means, some very poor communities, and I think what this complementary piece of legislation puts a good profile on the water issue in that Central Valley that is beyond just availability for the growers and extends to reliable and safe drinking water that is necessary for the residents of that valley as well. And I applaud the gentleman, Mr. Cox, for making this a complementary pieces of legislation that reinforce each other. I think it's important that this committee and within its jurisdiction exercise solutions that they see are fitting. If down the road it becomes necessary, as Mr. McClintock indicated, to deal with EPA, to try to reform what they're doing in terms of their thresholds and the sums of money that are available to communities, we can do that. But this is within our jurisdiction, and I appreciate the gentleman exercising that prerogative that we have in a jurisdiction to deal with this piece of legislation. I urge its approval, and if there is any amendments, the floor is open to any amendments. Mr. Cox, you have an amendment? Amendment number 32. That's the first amendment, and you're recognized, sir. It's a technical change, right?
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. The technical amendment clarifies the grant program established under the Disadvantaged Community Drinking Water Assistance Act would apply only to the 17 Western Reclamation States, American Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This amendment makes clear the intent and scope of my bill, which is to address drinking water challenges in the arid Western United States. Communities in the Western United States face unique challenges when it comes to water supply and drinking water. Bureau of Reclamation has decades of experience addressing water supply needs in the rural West and is appropriately suited to utilize that expertise to administer a program focused on clean water projects for disadvantaged communities in the West. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and final passage of the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, I'll yield back.
Discussion on amendment number 32. Hearing no further debate on the question on the Cox Amendment 32, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. And then the opinion of the chair is the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. If there's no further amendment, the question is on adopting the bill as amended and order it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Oh, the motion.
Mr. Bishop?
Can't we just do this like motion A or something, get it over with? Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of the intention to file additional or dissenting views on the bills just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered by the committee today.
The next item for consideration is H.R. 1904, offered by myself. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will recognize myself to speak on the legislation. H.R. 1904, the Indian Water Rights Settlement Extension Act. This bill addresses what can only be described as a water crisis in Indian country. Today, many tribal communities across the country live without running water, basic water infrastructure, and even though the federal government has a trust responsibility to help ensure tribal access, those conditions persist. My bill will address this problem by permanently extending the existing Reclamation Water Settlement Fund. Congress created the Reclamation Water Settlement Fund in 2009 and directed $120 million toward the fund per year from 220 through 229 to help pay for tribal water rights settlements as they occurred. As we've heard from the administration, all this money is already spoken for. By permanently extending this fund, this bill will make sure that funding is there for future tribal water settlements, which quantify tribal water rights and help pay for the water delivery infrastructure in tribal communities. Permanently extending this fund is critical given that there are over 280 federally recognized tribes in the West alone, and settlements have only been finished for a fraction of these tribes over the past 40 years. Since the settlements became the preferred policy of the federal government. In response to some criticism I think we'll hear, I should also mention the bill was intentionally modeled on measures supported by Republican committee members on the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, GOMESA. Just like this bill, GOMESA delayed revenue sharing provisions by decades in recognition of CBO rules. H.R. 1904 is also similar to the Ranking Member's Restore Our Parks Act, or ROPA, which makes use of unobligated federal energy revenue. The main difference is that this bill will use unobligated energy revenues funds to meet Indian tribal trust obligations and responsibilities that the federal government has. As I mentioned, this bill also alleviates pressure on the Bureau of Reclamation's operating budget, which currently dedicates 14% of its discretionary budget to tribal water rights settlements. This spending percentage has doubled over the past 15 years as new settlements have been approved by congressional action. That's why water users across the West, including those who usually don't engage on tribal issues, support the legislation. The bicameral bill is also widely supported by tribes and representatives of all Republican and Democratic Western governors. A version of this bill extending the settlement fund for 10 years recently passed the Republican-controlled Senate Committee of Jurisdiction with zero opposition. While we would like to see a more permanent fix, we will be open to further discussion with the Senate as to the duration of the legislation. With that, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the bill so that we can better meet our trust obligations and ensure that tribes have running water, basic water infrastructure, which is essential for the health, well-being, and the economic development of tribal communities. Before we begin the amendment process, anyone else wish to meet to the legislation? Who? Mr. McClintock, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Negotiating and litigating over water rights is a uniquely executive function. Approving the settlement is a legislative one. An Indian water settlement occurs when an Indian nation sues the federal government under the Winters Doctrine and claims that it's entitled, under law, to certain apportionments of water. It's the responsibility of the Attorney General to assess the legitimacy of the claim based on the facts and the law. If he's convinced that the government's case is weak and the Indian tribes is strong, it's his responsibility to negotiate with the tribe the best deal he can get for the government and compare that deal with the cost of litigation and the likely outcome of that litigation. Once that negotiation is concluded and both sides have agreed that it's in their best mutual interest to settle, then and only then is it supposed to be brought to the legislative branch for ratification and appropriation to settle and close the case. That's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way it once worked. But over the last 2 decades, this process has been usurped by Congress. Congress began proposing, negotiating, and agreeing to settlements that, with, shall we say, politically friendly tribes, even when our lawyers and the agencies believed the government was in the right and would prevail in court. This did a tremendous disservice to taxpayers by giving away the store to litigants filing meritless lawsuits who happened to have doting friends in Congress. To combat this practice under Republican leadership, the Natural Resources Committee implemented a policy to assure that settlements were only considered once the Attorney General and the affected agencies agreed that the lawsuit had merit and ought to be settled out of court to save taxpayers the potential of still higher costs if the matter went to court. At the outset of this Congress, I offered an amendment to codify this policy in the rules, which had been successfully applied to approve many settlements over the last few years. Specifically, it provided that before an Indian rights settlement is considered or recommended by the Natural Resources Committee, that the Departments of Interior and Justice and the plaintiffs all agree to the settlement, and that the department certify that it doesn't duplicate claims previously paid, that it doesn't pay meritless claims, and that it's in the best interests of taxpayers to approve the settlement rather than to go to court. This amendment was rejected, opening the floodgates to politically driven settlement claims being paid regardless of their actual merit, and in a manner that often leaves us open to still further claims. H.R. 1904 greases the skids on this practice by permanently extending the Reclamation Water Settlements Fund as a perpetual slush fund, bypassing the appropriation authority of Congress. This fund was first created by the Democrats in 2009 using a budget gimmick to avoid any costs under the analysis of the Congressional Budget Office. Now the Democrats are looking to capitalize on the same budget gimmick to permanently extend this fund. In 2009, when this fund was authorized, the Democratic-led House approved several water rights settlements that even the Obama administration expressed concerns over authorizing. The White Mountain Apache settlement had to be fixed several times, most recently in the fiscal year 2020 appropriations package. The AMDOT settlement is now demanding more money. For example, earlier this year, a Senate bill increased money for an already settled claim that, according to the CBO, will require $157 million more to be spent from this fund without further congressional appropriation over the next 10 years. This never-ending fund sets a perverse incentive in which Congress doesn't have to ensure the settlements it approves actually settle claims or protect the American taxpayer. For these reasons, I'd urge my colleagues to oppose the bill.
Anyone else wish to be recognized? Ms. Holland, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to express my support for H.R. 1904. And right now with this conversation, I'm feeling very lucky that my grandmother actually got plumbing in 1975. And that seemed late. I was 15 years old and we were still, taking baths in galvanized tubs and hauling water. So according to the Closing Water Access Gap in the United States study released last year, that is this, Native American households are 19 times more likely than white households to not have indoor plumbing. 58 out of every 1,000 Native American households lack complete plumbing. And an estimated 30% or more of people on the Navajo Nation lack access to running water. And I think we can all think about that when it's easy for us to just go to any faucet and turn it on. Most Americans take running water for granted, but for many Native Americans, getting clean water can mean driving 40 miles every few days and hauling it back to their homes. The federal government has a legal responsibility to help ensure access to water for federally recognized tribes. That is the federal government's trust responsibility. And this bill will provide a reliable funding stream for future tribal water rights settlements. And I thank you, Chairman, for bringing this bill to the committee, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Bishop?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing this bill here. This bill deals with a significant and important issue, but not necessarily in a significant and important way. Every chairman has the right to have a bill passed by his committee, and so I'm sure this will happen, but I don't think it actually solves the problem. This is not an issue of plumbing. This is an issue of water rights settlements that have to happen before that takes place. And as has been said, yeah, it's a gimmick. And if this bill is not passed, this fund will still exist, it will still be getting money, and it will stay until Congress decides to reauthorize it. Whether something is authorized permanently or in increments depends on how Congress wishes to take its responsibility for controlling spending and dealing with spending. Mr. McClintock was right. As we have tried to do in the past, only when something has been approved through the negotiation process with the executive branch, specifically having the Department of Justice as well as the OMB agreeing to something, then is something ready to go. We have certain bills that have gone through that process and have the Justice Department's agreement and have OMB's agreement and are simply ready for a codification or a statement of consent by Congress. Yet they're being held up because of this particular issue. I would like assurances from the chairman, if this actually goes to the floor, there is no intention of trying to couple other issues with this particular one. Because this is so flawed structurally, it has problems not only in the House, but will have severe problems in the Senate. And I certainly don't want those other Indian water right issues, which are settled and which are ready to go forward, to be held up because of that. More than 30 settlements have been ratified by Congress. The only outstanding settlement agreed to, I'm not going that far. I'm sorry, that sounds personal. Yeah, don't screw up my bill just because of this one. Okay. But that bill has gone through the process, has the agreement. So that's the issue at hand. It's the issue of the structure of the bill and the gimmick we're dealing with it, not whether we can create processes that are effective and efficient. And so with that, you got the votes, you're going to pass it. I guess you have a right to have your bill passed. Doesn't necessarily mean this solves the problem. And I certainly don't want the other water rights issues that are ready to move forward being held up any longer because of this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I felt I must talk on this one because for the 20-some-odd years I've been in this committee, I've heard Indian water rights put aside, ignored, and I think it's time that we begin to focus on the fact, as Ms. Halan said, that there are many Native Americans that don't have drinking water. And I know we passed about 6 bills when I was chair of the committee on Indian water rights, long-standing. The BIA wasn't very much helpful, and the fact remains that they still have a lot of problems. They still don't have drinking water, many of the tribes, and yet we take it for granted. That's okay. It isn't okay. And I think our bureaucracy are talking about it, and the fact that we talk about policy and politics, we just need to get it done, sir. I yield back. I yield to Mr. Grijalva.
Gentlelady for yielding. I think as we'll see later in the agenda, there are some that settlements that are going to be approved today that are added to the list. But you know, the issue of taking the legal step to make a settlement, I understand that. The issue of how we provide the infrastructure and the resources for a sovereign nation, be it the Navajo, be it any other tribe, to be able to put the infrastructure to deliver to its people water, then is the settlement fund. And that is why it's so important. You know, you have, even in the state of Arizona, legislation that is tying Indian water settlements with the gaming compact, that if you don't have a settlement, then you can't participate in the discussion about how that gaming compact is going to be done in Arizona. Pushing and insisting that those settlements be done rapidly and irrespective of content and irrespective of legal review in order to lock those water settlements in. I think there's apples and oranges consideration going on with that legislation. But I use that as a point that a great deal of pressure, particularly as water availability and conservation measures become more and more prominent in the Southwest, that these settlements by tribes become more and more urgent as well. So I think that extending permanently, assuring the security that funding will be there, will help move settlements along, and more importantly, at some point, having specific timetable as to when that infrastructure will be in place to deliver high-quality, clean water to the residents of a particular tribal lands and reservations. That's the intent of this. And like I indicated earlier, this is not this is not going to be tied to any other piece of legislation, but we are open to, the Senate reauthorized it for 10 years. We're open to discussions on permanent versus a duration of time, and we'll pursue those discussions with the Senate as well, since they have already passed theirs out of committee. With that, I yield back to the gentlelady, and she yields back. Any further debate? Without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. And are there any other amendments to the ANS? If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the ANS as, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it, the ANS is adopted. If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Mr. McClintock has requested a roll call vote, and the vote will be postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. Moving on to the item for consideration is the committee resolution offered by myself. Without objection, the resolution would be considered in read and open to amendment at any point. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the resolution. We're now considering a resolution authorizing the chair, myself, as chair of the Resources Committee, to issue subpoenas as part of our legislative and investigative work. In essence, the full complement of our oversight work. My Republican colleagues probably assume I am happy to be here and to be having this resolution before us, but I'm not. I've opposed subpoenas from the committee when previous administration made good faith efforts to cooperate with the oversight work. As chair, I've worked for more than a year to fulfill this committee's legislative and oversight responsibilities without taking a step to bring forth a resolution, as we are today. But no one can argue that this administration is making those good faith efforts not meaningless in this Congress. The President himself has repeatedly dismissed Congress as a co-equal branch of government and has ordered blanket denials of requests for information from congressional committees. The President has combined his eagerness to undermine the legitimate powers of Congress with an astonishing record of apparent conflicts of interest, corruption, and cronyism. After more than a year of stonewalling and smokescreens, I would be failing my responsibilities as chair if I did not seek this authority. I think we have been left with no choice. The language of the resolution is broad, but the power granted by the resolution is modest. Given that it would only grant the authority most House committee chairs already have in their committee rules. 13 out of 21 committees have unilateral subpoena power. We're seeking to add the Resources Committee to that list. There will be a vote on whether the committee should have every legislative investigative tool possible in the face of the Trump administration's unprecedented disrespect for Congress and the constant abuse of the power of the executive. I pledge today, that, as I did during our organizing meeting, that no subpoenas will be sent without notice to my Republican colleagues and to all the members of this committee. And I can assure you that any subpoena that is issued will be on a topic you have been hearing about for months, if not years. No subpoena will be issued for any information we have not given the recipient ample time to provide, including extensive efforts to find compromise or address any privilege or other legitimate concern that the administration might raise. I do not intend to surprise or harass anybody. I intend for this committee to do its job. The memo provided to members details the number of information requests we have put to the administration and their unprecedented level of obstruction. I urge my colleagues to review that record. The Trump administration claims that they have acted within the law when, for example, they destroyed national monuments or forced the BLM employees to move their families across the country or lose their jobs. I believe their actions violate the law. But if the administration is correct, then existing law needs to be changed. Of course, we cannot craft such legislation or even know whether it is warranted without the testimony and the documentation the administration is withholding. This vote is about what it means to be a duly elected member of Congress and a serving member of this committee. It is arguably the most important vote we could take at this moment, and I urge my colleagues to support the resolution. Before we consider amendment, let me open the floor to any member that wishes to be recognized on the resolution. And Mr. Bishop, you're recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your efforts and what you're doing. And I want you to know I have an internal struggle right now. I would like more than anything to call for an adjournment just to force your damn members to be here and listen to this debate. It is unfortunate, it is totally unfortunate that we are having a significant discussion and your members exited. They need to be here. And I'm sorry, if we will have a debate, I'm not going to do it because we have other committees that are having markups shortly. But it is ridiculous for us to consider these amendments, these issues, and debate them openly when there's nobody there, when you're talking to an empty chair. And once again, there are more of us here than there are you. That's wrong. It is simply wrong. Now, having said that, let's go on to the rest of this. We are dealing with a de facto rule change that is being done in the middle of a session. The appropriate time to do that would have been at the beginning of the session or the beginning of the next session. What we are doing with the resolution is actually amending our committee rules, which makes me wonder why we are doing it in this way. It's the same vote. You'd win it either way once your members finally do show up again after the discussion's been over. But what we are asking for in this amendment, what you are asking for in this amendment, is something that Morris Udall, who I look at every day and for whom this room was named, he never had this authority. Our counterparts in the Senate, the Energy and Natural Resource Committee, they don't have this authority. Every subpoena he did had to have a vote. Every subpoena that takes place in the Senate either has to have a vote or the concurrence of the ranking member. When I was chairman, I used the same rules you are attempting to change today. And we used it significantly and successfully. I think perhaps some of this can be traced not just to the need of subpoenas being issued without a whole lot of public notice, but to substandard investigative track record of the majority. The majority in this last year has asked lots of questions on the agency. very overly broad questions of the agency. Some questions were to an agency that had no authority over the issue whatsoever. Some questions sought information that was actually publicly available. Some of the questions, or numerous letters, went to agencies weren't requests for information at all, but merely a disagreement with policy in the form of a letter. And then when the agency did not respond because it was simply a disagreement over policy, they were now labeled as incomplete responses by the majority and has been used as a justification for this rule change today. Now, given their record, I don't know if today's resolution is going to help to get better results, but the blanket authority is being given to coerce agencies and private individuals into meeting botched and overly broad requests. So the fact that we're doing this change is unusual. The fact that we're doing it here and the fact that we're doing it without members actually here to listen to the debate on which and make a decision on which they will later vote is abhorrent. And it is certainly not in the best standards of legislation or the best standards of Congress or even in logic. Now, having said that, I also want to know that this is a serious matter. Given the gravity of today's action, I have engaged the chairman on some proposed amendments and that we have come to an agreement on some nominal guardrails that I think are important. There are some important changes that Mr. Grijalva has agreed, and that there are some important changes that Mr. Grijalva and his staff have rejected. I want to thank him for the engagement publicly, and I want to say that I appreciate that, and I appreciate what we will be able to make some changes in the resolution that you propose. Doesn't necessarily make it a good resolution, but I want to publicly acknowledge that your efforts to try and engage were indeed there. At the same time, what we're doing is something that is wrong, that will allow subpoenas to be given basically in the dark going into the future, more so than has ever happened in the past. And that's the kind of issue. Whether the other committees and the House have this kind of power authority is really irrelevant. Should subpoenas be issued in the dark? Should there be some kind of concurrence? Should there be some kind of ability to have our side know what is going on? And once again, I want to try and balance this by letting you know that I recognize that your engagement and you have agreed to certain changes that make it better, but we still haven't solved the problem. With that, not only do I yield back, but I've gone over 11 seconds. You can subtract it from my next time I talk. Or from next time Ms. Napolitano talks, or even.
Now, let me recognize Mr. Costa, you indicated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me suggest that the ranking member's comments are well taken. There should be a majority of members on our side here to listen to this important debate. Anytime you have a rules change that is significant like this, it really, I think, requires that the majority of the members of the committee on both sides be here to listen and participate. Having said that, there are many other committees that are meeting at this time, and we're split in different directions. Let me talk about the actual resolution before as it relates to the subpoena power, though. I've given a lot of thought to this, and I've done a cursory look at the subpoena powers for other committees here in the House. And, you know, the majority of them have various types of ability to offer subpoenas. They vary. And so there's obviously, based on tradition, based upon who has chaired the committees, who's been in the majority, who's been in the minority, have changed over a period of time. The chair, I believe, in a number of conversations I've had with him, is very sincere about his desire to implement this change to deal with areas that are concerned by he and other members to practice proper oversight. Having been here 16 years, my observation is that Congress does oversight in a haphazard fashion at best. you know, I don't think when we have new members and you go through your initiation period that we actually provide enough understanding of how you do good oversight. And certainly both sides, depending upon who's been in the majority and who's been in the minority, have used sometimes the oversight process for political purposes. But I think that's historical, I would guess. We ought to do good oversight. That should be a practice that we're all engaged in for the right reasons, not necessarily for political reasons. Having said that, I believe that the chair is sincere in his desire to try to prudently use this subpoena process, if in fact this resolution is enacted, to try to furtherance the effort of meaningful oversight so that we can do the committee's work. Does that mean we will always agree on when this this authority is exercised? I suspect not. Having said that, I think that it's important that we work together. I think the ranking member Bishop's effort to reach some accommodation with the chair on this resolution before us, I think, is a good sign, and I would commend both of them for that work. And we need to kind of do our best. Clearly, we've been involved in our subcommittees here in this effort, along with the full committee. And I think this proposal here is an opportunity to try to furtherance good oversight where we have difficulty obtaining information that is deemed important to have for that purpose. I reserve the right when I think that there will be an occasion where I think that we are doing it in a way that I don't think is constructive to obviously indicate my concern. But at this time, I think we should support this measure. I think it's well thought out. I think there are guardrails, as the ranking member indicated, that provide all committee members some ability to weigh in when these issues of subpoenas come up. And I commend the chair and the ranking member for their efforts to work together, and I urge that we support this resolution before us. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm up next.
Yes, he is.
Thank you. I am a little disturbed about this because I do think there's some hypocrisy in this proposal. I will say that because in September 2016, there was a letter addressed to the Chairman Lamar Smith, co-signed by the Democrat on our committee. The following was written by Democrats. We are writing today to express our disappointment in our decision, or your decision, to issue unilateral and unpreceded subpoenas. The letter also states we're deeply concerned that these subpoenas will interfere with a legitimate fraud investigation. It goes on and on and on, and the statement was by Mr. Tonko. And I really, you know, I would appreciate it if you'd come to us and said, why is this needed? I was chairman of this committee 6 years. Mo Udall was chairman of this committee for 6 years. Saylor was chairman of this committee 6 years. We never had that power, yet we had oversight. We had oversight. And I believe we run this committee very well. I do not appreciate the fact this committee has become very partisan. It never was before. Even when George Miller was here and he was chairman, he didn't have this power. We argued amongst the committee, we discussed things, and we came to agreement jointly. Jointly. Chairman and ourselves, whether we would subpoena somebody. This is extreme power for, frankly, a very individual, the chairman. No disrespect to the chairman, but why are you doing this? It's just anti-Trump? Is that all it is? Do you really believe there's something wrong? Come to us and say, this is wrong, let's subpoena them. We do it jointly. This Congress has been divided, and it continues to be divided because no one wants to work together. And that's wrong. There has to be a check somewhere. When it's unilateral, that means we are not even consulted. You can't have a committee that passes good public policy on lands, parks, refuge, whatever you want to do, unless we work together. And this is changing the rules. In the middle of the stream, as the chairman and ranking member said, talk to us. Talk to the ranking member. Talk to me. Say, okay, this is why we want it. You may be perfectly right to issue a license to a poacher to get an answer that no one else knows about. So I respectfully say this is not a good idea. It will divide this committee. We won't accomplish what we seek, and we do not do our duty to this country nor the people that you represent. With that, I yield back. Yes.
Mr. Chairman? Over here on your right. Unless there's someone on that side.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop, once again, on your first comment, I refer you back to when I was chair. There was nobody here on the Republican side. I was alone. So it happens. And it's wrong. But this is a committee that doesn't somehow impose upon the members the necessity, the importance, and the integrity that has to be maintained. And I realize that. But how do we do it, all of us, not just this side or that side, together? And on the second point, I don't see why there is such a brouhaha over the subpoena power. I understand that maybe they didn't go to you and discuss the issue, that maybe that is what should have been done. But I yield to the chairman.
Just briefly comment on, Mr. Young, I certainly don't have the tenure, nor have I served 6 years as chairman of this committee, and certainly don't have the historic status that Mr. Udall from my part of the world is from, as chairman of this committee. But on this experience of this year, and many of the subcommittees that I have attended, and the frustration of both chairs and to some extent spoken and unspoken frustration of the ranking members, in that even when the administration and Interior sends its witnesses, they're ill-prepared to respond to the questions that come from the committee. The information is spotty, if they're at best, and a kind of a very cavalier attitude to the workings of this committee in terms of the work it does. When we have legislation, as you enjoyed in the past, you would get comments and recommendations and suggestions from the administration. We receive little or no response to legislation that is major, that is before this committee. Second of all, even as simple as we want to know why the health studies on mountaintop removal were canceled. That information is not forthcoming. That was a health study of significance under the jurisdiction of this committee. And as the list indicates in the memorandum that we sent you, these questions have been persistent and they've been constant on the part of this committee. I have not wanted to chase things down a rabbit hole and just create issues to create issues. But it comes a fundamental time where this committee has to establish itself as a co-equal and not to be, we're not here as potted plants to be cared for and watered when the administration decides it's time, nor are we here to be cheerleaders for any position that the administration might take. We're here as an independent body with co-equal status, and I think if anything else, the discussion of the subpoena is about us asserting that co-equal status, and the subpoena power that I am asking for and the resolution asking for. Mr. Bishop is correct. That should have been a consideration when we did the rules, and those rules should have been changed at that time, and we could have had that debate then. But we didn't. And to continue in the same practice where this committee is essentially ignored, where the majority's requests are ignored, and when witnesses come ill-prepared, without information, and then information that's requested at a meeting in public is not forthcoming, those begin to accumulate. And we've reached the accumulation point, my friends, that if this committee, not only for the majority, but for the status in the future, whoever might be chairman, whoever might be the majority, for this committee to enjoy the status of a co-equal branch of government, not more powerful than, but equal to the administration, I think is underlining goal of this resolution. It's not to assert power for a person. It is not to to make political hay and grandstand over any particular thing. But as we form legislation and as we see report after report that comes to this committee via the media, via independent organizations outside of Congress that report information that should have been justifiably and in terms of both past practice in front of this committee, one has to wonder if this kind of very cavalier attitude to this committee shouldn't change. If subpoena power provides us with a step toward that equal access and sense of equal standing, then I think it must be supported, not just for my personal sake, but for the sake of this committee as a whole. I think we've reached that point, and the stonewalling, ignoring this committee has to end, and the subpoena power that is being sought today is tempered. It has fail-safes. If the majority decides that a particular direction that I'm recommending is not a direction they want, the majority can sign a letter, and then we have a vote, and then we decide whether we go in that direction or not. And that was at the suggestion of the ranking member, and I appreciate that. I think we should have a fail-safe. But my only guarantee to you is that I will work as hard as I can to make sure that we are substantive, that we are correct, and if we see conflict and if we see issues that must be explored and dug into, that we're going to do that with the full information and knowledge of all the committee members, not just the majority. That's the way it should be. That's the way it was in the past. And you know, Mo Udall had the advantage of having an administration he could work with. Mr. Young, you had the advantage, even there might have been another party of administration that responded to you and respected your position and the composition of this committee. We don't have that status right now. And if a subpoena is necessary in order to force that status, then I think that's the vote before us today.
Well, the gentleman yield. Gentlemen.
I went way over my time.
No, you don't. I just want to, will you yield for a moment?
I will yield for a moment.
What you've said is what I wanted to hear, is we do consult with one another. If there's something wrong, we will work together. And that makes this committee stronger. It shouldn't be one vote on that side, one vote on this side. It said, I don't like the unilateral ability to subpoena without consultation. And if I understood what you said, that's really what you're saying. I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Holland, excuse me, I'm sorry.
No, Mr. Chairman, I said you should take my 11 seconds over from Grace, not add it to it.
Ms. Holland? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I just want to take a moment and echo what Ranking Member Bishop said, and also the very important historical context of the Dean of our House, Mr. Young. I think they're exactly right. I oppose this resolution, and I think that is regretful. I mean, most of us on this committee agree that strong congressional oversight is not a partisan issue. It shouldn't be. In fact, several members on our side of the aisle expressed concerns with DOI document production during the oversight hearing last September. Everybody remembers that. Just last week, myself and 146 other members of the Republican Study Committee released a government accountability report, and we devoted a huge portion of that report to steps that should be taken to restore Article I power. We believe in that. The problem here isn't our willingness to perform our constitutionally directed duties. As other Republicans and I have been saying for over a year now, our concerns lie with the abuse of power that is becoming too widespread in this Congress. The degree to which the other side seems to be willing to trample on the input of the minority is really incredible. There have always been frustrations. There's a natural sort of friction in our system between the executive and legislative branches. Some of that was designed by the founders. There's always been frustrations in every previous Congress about documents that were requested of government agencies that didn't come timely or in a broad enough scope. But there are systems in place to deal with that. We don't have to change the rules and go to unilateral authority to deal with it. I guess I would acknowledge this morning I'm a little bit jaded because I also serve on the House Judiciary Committee where it's become a sport to steamroll due process over there. This can easily get out of control. And that's the problem that I think everyone is articulating this morning. The authority to issue subpoenas is an immense power, that's supposed to be invoked only as a last resort. You're compelling the production of documents or testimony under penalty of contempt. And I want to point this out too, and everybody, maybe you haven't thought about this, but every member of this committee on the other side is now on record saying that you believe that contempt of Congress is an impeachable offense. I mean, this is big stuff. And it's not difficult to connect the dots here to see where all this is leading. There's no recognition of due process at all, no recognition of executive privilege, no recognition of the third branch of government, the judiciary, that steps in when Congress and the administration have a dispute. That's always been the case until now. Now we just go for impeachment. Changing this committee's rules over halfway through the Congress is just another example in the long list of abuses that our side and the minority has been subjected to in this Congress. And under this resolution, we'll have no opportunity to debate the specific subpoenas on their merits and no opportunity to offer amendments, and we'll basically be cut out of the process entirely. Even with that fail-safe there, it's still the unilateral authority of the chairman, and I just think it opens another Pandora's box that we should avoid. And for that reason, I oppose the resolution, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Holland.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to say that this week, the National Congress of American Indians is here in Washington, D.C., and I just came from there. I gave 2 speeches to that body and talked about how well we work together, because that's what people want to hear. I talked about over 250 bipartisan bills that passed the House floor, and I know that we agree on a lot of things, and I have full confidence that we will continue to move all of that forward. And I'd just like to say that I don't want us to forget that we had requested documents from the Department of the Interior. We got back 100 pages of wingdings and information about Doggy Day at DOI and things that have no relevancy to the information that we asked for. And I also I am on the subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples, and there was a administration representative who came and lied to the committee. He lied to the committee. It was very clear because his testimony was in conflict to someone who was sitting right there giving their testimony. And so I don't think that's right. I think that if we want information and it's relevant to what we are trying to do for the American people, that we deserve to have the truth and we deserve to have the information that we actually request. So with all due respect, Mr. Young, you know I have the deepest respect for you, and I appreciate everything that we are trying to do here. I don't think this is going to jeopardize our ability to be bipartisan and to work towards solutions that we know that the American people deserve. I just feel like we need to have the truth when it's asked for. And with that, Chairman, I yield.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Go, sir. You recognize, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, let's be clear. In the 113th and 114th Congress, when this committee was forced by the Obama administration to seek subpoenas from then Chairman Hastings, came to the committee for direct authority for the specific purposes. Once again, we itemized each one of those. And when you want to look back at it, I mean, that administration was also wrought with problems. Fast and Furious, IRS, we can go down the list. I mean, Sally Jewell trying to get information in regards to an EPA blowout in Colorado that had a huge effect, you know, for the native populations. So I get where you're going, but once again, we ought to have that debate. The other thing I want to remind you too is that sometimes when you have an open debate about a subpoena power, particularly when it's a favorable or there's dialogue from the party in charge, whether we're in the minority right now, the administration actually looks at that, and maybe they will comply a little better. Sometimes you get something with honey versus that pounding of an axe. So from that standpoint, I think we also have to look at the unbridled aspects of who's going to be a victim here. So what we're doing today is we're giving unequivocal power. We can talk about the sidebars and the side rails. They're really insignificant. But what about the individual that is called in front of here, where the redress is catastrophic? For example, all of a sudden what you're doing is you're taking an individual and you're putting the full wrath of the federal government against them. How will we respond? We ought to be able to have that conversation back and forth as to why that aspect should be done. We've had oversight hearings, so we should have tailored what we're actually after. So this broad swath of subpoena power is not what we're telling people we're doing. What you're doing is you're going to do this unequivocally, wherever we want to go. Individuals, industry, and that is not a right way of going about this. This is not the same thing that we've done in oversight. In oversight, those subpoenas were brought in front of everybody to have the open discussion. Yes, they were issued, but I think the transparency in front of that is very important. Yeah, I get it. I get it. You're all angry with this administration. That's very evident. But you don't throw out good process with the bathwater. You just don't. You also got to look at the people that you're going to run over. That is very poignant here. So I don't think we're asking for anything other than having due process in regards to the subpoena power. And once again, I find it very frightening that what we're doing today, and I'm hoping that everybody will vote against this legislation. And with that, I will yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a matter of great concern, this resolution. I appreciated my friend Mr. Cox's comment that we shouldn't be taking partisan actions, but this really will lend itself precisely to partisan actions. The typical oversight investigation is supposed to involve multiple steps, with the issuance of a subpoena being the very last resort. We saw this in judiciary, and it led to an article of impeachment. As a couple of professors said, I mean, the abuse of power was by the House of Representatives in assuming they are executive, legislative, and judicial when you won't even go to the judicial to try to resolve disputes. You just go right into impeachment. And we were told, gee, impeachment is the remedy if somebody doesn't answer subpoenas. And this is going to be unilateral subpoenas. This will lend itself to more and more partisanship. And there's just too many things around this country that we ought to be working together on and doing together instead of building more partisan ability to destroy what this committee should be doing in a bipartisan fashion. And I have thought about this quote numerous times, even though it was 6 years ago, but it sure seems to apply here, and it's a quote from a friend across the aisle. Quote, it is really embarrassing, frankly, what passes for oversight sometimes around here, and it does seem to me this committee would rather have the issue than have the information. And that was my friend Mr. Huffman from 6 years ago, September 10th. But it is true. If we want real oversight, let's work together and then to further enable this committee's chair to, in a partisan, unilateral manner, to subpoena individuals. Like my friend said, they're up against the full weight of the federal government. Is that the big bully we want to be? I mean, this cuts both ways. You put this rule in, then I would be willing to bet that someday, whenever that is, that we're back in the majority, that will be used to bully friends of yours that shouldn't be bullied, but will be because of the precedent you put in place. We're not good about removing bad precedents if it allows for partisanship. We have trouble removing those. So I just really hate to see this step. Seems to me we ought to exempt private persons from unilateral subpoena authority. And another thing I think we ought to do, it ought to require the agreement of the ranking member, and absent that, then at least have a vote of the majority. I mean, for heaven's sake, even Adam Schiff was agreeing to that. Was a provision that he had in the impeachment rules that I would submit were very unfair, but for heaven's sake, at least they allowed that. But the two-step process that's supposed to require reaching out of the committee, trying to work things out as a last resort, then hitting with subpoena, that's not here, which means you can have subpoena unreasonable as to time and place and requirements, and the failure to answer that, it's already been established, it's now precedent. You move right to impeachment when you don't get the response, and call it abuse of power or obstruction of Congress. This is dangerous stuff. We need to back up a step, fix this so that it will allow for bipartisan work in the future. And I know what'll happen when we get the majority. We're not going to back off of this. It's going to come back to haunt, and I think that's going to be extremely unfortunate for the future. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. For the record, I'd like to say thank you for last week's moving of the markup to today to not conflict with the National Prayer Breakfast. But also, I'd like to express my staunch opposition to granting unilateral subpoena authority to the chairman, something that half of my Democrat colleagues in this committee previously expressed publicly. This is because this unprecedented change invites abuse and diminishes the prospect for any oversight. This authority also removes the minority's voice and ability to debate these important issues. I'm not sure why we can't have debate and votes. You have the majority, but at least we'd be on the record for our opposition and have a full dialogue about why it's being needed. Further, this resolution grants authority which is beyond the normal authority given with unilateral subpoena power and beyond the scope of this committee. This resolution also allows the chairman to subpoena whomever he chooses, including members of the Department of Agriculture and Department of Commerce. We have a committee on agriculture and a committee on energy and commerce. These are the committees which should focus on subpoena authority over those agencies, not the Natural Resource Committee. Additionally, these agencies were not notified of their inclusion in the resolution. It was also not included in any press releases or coverage on the matter, making it hidden to everyone. The worst part about this is that I know firsthand, as many of you do, how prompt and responsive these agencies are with congressional staff. Whether it be the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, or the Department of Commerce, they have been great to work with on various issues through Congress. But my Democrat colleagues will tell you that, not tell you that. They will also not tell you about the fact that they never reached out to the DOA with any concerns about their working relationship. They're not interested in engaging on the issues. They're also not interested in discussing what all their investigations have produced, which has been nothing. They're all interested in delay tactics, press releases under which they cherry pick a narrative to fuel their preconceived notions about their distaste for the president and his administration, and all of which has not been backed up by facts. We just went through a process that was very uncomfortable for all of us, probably drove us farther apart than we've probably been in 25 years. And maybe that's the impetus for this lack of debate and ability to go forward on subpoena power. We should not support this resolution, which is simply to compensate for unsuccessful investigations by the majority. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Gonzalez.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern here, I can understand maybe the reasons behind asking for subpoena powers to many of the agencies to comply with the requirements of the committee. My concern is not about if they're bringing the information or not, it's how we ask for that information. It's about the transparency and accountability process, and our rules already provide that procedure, allowing members of this committee first to debate, second to vote, how we're going to get that information accountable for the people. My concern here is we're changing that rule to allow just that power to go to the chairman of the committee. And this is not about if the chairman of the committee got the idea or do we support him or not. It's about taking away, giving up the right to debate and vote for all members of this committee, majority and minority. And that's the reason that the rules already got the procedures of how we can ask for those subpoena powers. Other concern I do have, we may be asking for that subpoena power just for cabinet members or members of a different agency because they failed to provide information to this committee. But the resolution we are approving today, it also leaves the doors open to subpoena many private persons or civilians. We don't have any information about who the chairman is going to be doing a subpoena because we don't have the opportunity to debate that. We don't have the opportunity to vote on that issue. So I think it's a broad power that will take away the rights of members to ask, to debate, and know. I'm sure that if it's an agency that is not complying with this committee because any of the bills or the information that has been required in a committee, many members will be in favor of voting for that because that's the reason this committee has that power. But why allowing just one person, not even with the concurrence or the approval of the ranking member or even consulting the ranking member? Why should we be afraid of consulting or saying that a federal agency is not complying with information? I think we are moving in the wrong direction. I think we should embrace the healthy debate of ideas or why we need to subpoena any agency, or in this case, opening the door to subpoena not just cabinet members or agencies over the jurisdiction of this committee, but even private people or civilians. And I think that content is not clear in the resolution as well. And I think moving away the power of the members of this committee, changing the way the procedure has been done, will take away the transparency, will take away the accountability, and of course, the integrity of this committee on who or why we're going to be subpoena somebody. With that, I got strong opposition of this resolution. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Nagus, you wish to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll support the resolution today because I think that the chairman has been extraordinarily patient and that he has and the committee staff have engaged in an accommodation process, and that, as Representative Howland so eloquently stated, this committee and the American people deserve answers to the important questions that we've posed. All that being said, I would be remiss if I just didn't take a moment to perhaps express my confusion as to reconciling some of the views that are being expressed by my colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle as they express outrage over this notion that the committees, or committee chairs rather, can now issue unilateral subpoenas. Mr. Johnson, my friend who is always so eloquent, and I think certainly serving together on Judiciary Committee, I appreciate the arguments that he made. However, he was not here when the House Republicans years ago made the change to give House chairmen the ability to issue unilateral subpoenas, nor was I. And so I find it, again, difficult to reconcile. I'll just quote from an article, Politico article, on January 12, 2015, the title, GOP Set to Strengthen Committee Chairman's Subpoena Power. House Republicans are about to give more of their committee leaders the same unilateral subpoena powers that former Oversight Chairman Darrell Issa wielded against the Obama administration in his probes into the IRS in Fast and Furious. That change means that in a break from years of tradition, Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman Fred Upton wouldn't need to consult with his panel's top Democrat before subpoenaing documents or witnesses. The GOP is also proposing similar boosts in authority for Financial Services Committee Chairman Jeb Henserling, whose panel's jurisdiction includes Dodd-Frank, and for Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte, who will oversee any probes into immigration. And the article goes on from there. My point is this. I don't fault Mr. Johnson, because he was not in Congress when that change was made, nor was I. But I find it a bit rich and ironic for some of the more senior friends of mine on the other side of the aisle who were part of these changes being made years ago to now express dismay that this chairman, after a year and 2 months...
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield in a moment. After a year and 2 months into the 116th Congress, failing to get any reasonable or cogent answers from the Department of Interior, has decided to take this next logical and prudent step of having the authority to issue subpoenas so that, again, we can get answers to the questions that we deserve. To the extent that there are members on the other side of the aisle who, actually protested this move years ago, I'm certainly welcome to hear that. But beyond that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Wait, but I asked the gentleman to yield.
The gentleman will yield.
But I just suggest one thing. This committee did not do that. That's what I said before. We didn't have to do that.
And reclaim my time. I appreciate...
Just a moment. I was one here, and we rejected that when I was chairman. And so did you all did, everybody else. So, don't lay the blame on this committee's always been bipartisan.
And reclaim my time, Mr. Young, I would say this, and I respect your long service to this committee. While you, very well, as you've attested, made that case, many other members of this committee who serve on judiciary, who serve on financial services, who serve on agriculture, who serve on science, did absolutely nothing when they had that opportunity. So for them to come forward now and make the case that this committee should not take this step, again, I find that a bit ironic, but I appreciate the point that you've made. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the debate we're able to have right now and the arguments from Mr. Neguse. I appreciate that very much, but it's also ironic to sit on this side when we were in the majority and see the left making the same arguments with just as much passion that now you are standing against. I mean, so let's look what we're dealing with here, among other things. And Ms. Holland, I appreciate your comments earlier and appreciate your leadership on so many fronts. What we're dealing here, among other things, is an issue of trust. And both sides, we've got to learn to trust one another, and the precedent that's being established here today does not help us move in that direction. And the issue, regardless of what other committees have done, is that this committee has never gone down this path before. So why are we doing that? We are further driving a wedge that does not need to be driven in this committee. We need to work together as much as possible, and the steps being taken today are not going to help in that direction. And I would bring up a different issue. I know the Department of Interior has been mentioned several times today, but I do not believe this move ultimately is all about proper oversight. I think it's a power grab. And you're going to see that as an inappropriate statement, perhaps, or something you certainly would disagree with. But again, that circles back around to a trust issue. But I make that statement that it's a power grab rather than an attempt to see proper oversight, because you would typically think that to make an issue like this, to make a motion, a resolution of this nature would involve agencies who are not complying. And because they're not complying, we need to go down this path. And perhaps we've seen some of that with the Department of Interior or some others. But I can give another example where that's totally not the issue at all, the USDA. This committee, the majority, made requests to the USDA had 7 different productions, sent over 9,000 documents to this committee. And instead of being appreciative, this committee was upset that too much information was sent. So USDA asked for, can we have a better focus? What is it that you're looking for? And this committee refused to provide that kind of information. So it's kind of like, what in that case, what is the agency supposed to do? They can't win for losing. They provide information, and it's not acceptable. Had they not provided the information, it would not be acceptable. And so it appears to me that ultimately there's a frustration here, among other things, that to me is rooted in investigative incompetence or perhaps laziness on this committee to do the part that they're supposed to do, at least to narrow the scope of the information that we're looking for. And for us now to go down this path, which in this case appears to me a power grab that continues driving a wedge of distrust rather than bringing us together in ways that this committee has done in years past, I think sets an extremely dangerous precedent that is not going to be healthy for us as a committee as we move forward. And so I would just ask us to please use not only caution, but I would ask that we would have the discipline to withdraw this resolution and to continue down a path of let's work together, and together, if there are issues, we can together request subpoenas, as we have done in the past. I just think we're moving down an extremely dangerous path that this committee doesn't need to go down, and I appreciate your willingness to indulge me for a few moments, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's only one rule in the entire book that benefits the majority. That's the rule that says the majority rules. Every other rule is for the benefit of the minority, to assure that it has a say in the deliberations, that it has an opportunity to be consulted and to offer modifications to the majority's proposal, all of which the majority is free to take or reject as it sees fit. Now, this committee, more than most other committees of the House, has always had a tradition of bipartisanship when it comes to matters within its jurisdictions. Mr. Young pointed out, this committee's Republicans never gave up that tradition. Always, when we've issued subpoenas, we've done so by majority vote of this committee unless we're in recess. This allows the minority to offer advice, to ask questions, to raise objections, to make suggestions, a process that can often produce a bipartisan vote that adds moral authority to the legal authority of the subpoena. Now, as I said at a previous hearing, there is a natural tension between the executive and the legislative branches established by our Constitution. The executive cannot interfere with the legislative branch any more than the legislative branch can interfere with the executive. But the legislative branch has a legitimate role to provide oversight, that is, to ask questions, even embarrassing questions, in fact, especially embarrassing questions, as to how the executive's discharging the laws that the Congress has made. It's often in the executive's best interest to cooperate with legitimate requests in order to foster goodwill that makes policy making by co-equal branches easier and better informed and more open. And the frustrations by the Democrats that they're expressing over a lack of cooperation by the Trump administration is no different than the frustrations that we Republicans had with the Obama administration. So there's a certain degree of sympathy with which many of us view the concerns that have been expressed. I mean, Sally Jewell was not exactly a Kathy Chatterbox when it came to responding to requests by this committee for explanations and documents. A Gold King toxic waste bill comes to mind. And as I look at the long list of requests for documents that have been made by the Democrats of this committee, I will say a lot of them seem to be fishing expeditions designed not to provide oversight, but to tie up the departments in a manner that obstructs their work. But some of their requests are legitimate and reasonable. So why not put the issuance of subpoenas to a vote, as this committee has always done, again, except during recesses? That's not going to alter in any way the majority's power to issue subpoenas. After all, the majority rules. but it will allow the minority to provide input and perhaps even lend bipartisan support to these subpoenas. The rules of this committee assure that when a subpoena is issued, it's not being issued by the whim of the chairman, but only after deliberation by the whole committee. That, too, assures that a subpoena from this committee is a serious product issued after debate and vote. Now, what this proposal does is to bypass the deliberative process that backs subpoenas with the moral authority of the whole committee, and instead it replaces that with the will of the chairman. The practical effect will be to allow subpoenas to be issued like popcorn in the most partisan of circumstances, which will likely stiffen legal resistance to them by the administration and cheapen their authority. But what I most ask the majority to consider is what I said when I began. Rules protect the minority's right to be consulted. The majority has the power to change these rules to eliminate the minority's ability to consult. That's all true. But I would warn my friends to take very seriously what Mr. Gohmert has said. Rules aren't the only things that change. Majorities change. These days, they change quite often. And if you change these rules, that change is going to stay in the rules. And a year from now, you may be facing a Republican chairman using this new authority to issue subpoenas without consulting you. And you may find subpoenas being issued to every left-wing NGO, every green energy crony capitalist, every ideological zealot in the bureaucracy, with no opportunity for you to question or protest. I can't say I find that prospect altogether unappealing. But before voting, you might want to consider Clint Eastwood's famous question, do you feel lucky? I yield back.
Any further discussion? I hope not. We can move on. Oh, of course, Mr. Huffman.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think it is important to acknowledge that the reason we're doing this after 14 months of desperate attempts to not go there, to try to work cooperatively with this administration, is that we have never seen a president like this or an administration like this when it comes to the blanket stonewalling. We're encouraged to use the legal system, and yet in court this administration is making up new immunities out of whole cloth and arguing that this president can't even be investigated. So let's just be honest about the elephant in the room. We've never seen anything like this administration when it comes to the resistance and the stonewalling. And that's why after 14 months of trying to work cooperatively, we are unfortunately breaking a little bit of precedent in this committee and giving the chairman this authority, which I'm glad to hear we may never have to use, because my friends across the aisle are acting like they're ready to join us in trying to get all this information and help oversight work better. If that's the case, if you match those words with deeds, we won't ever have to use this subpoena authority, and we'd be thrilled, because we want the information, not the issue, to speak to my friend's recitation of my quote from a few years ago. With that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
Thank you very much. And let me, finally, I think it's important to put some historical context to this discussion. The breadth and the scope of this resolution is not unprecedented. In 2014, the Republican-controlled committee voted to authorize then Chairman Hastings to subpoena, among other things, apparent conflicts of interest by current and former Department of Interior employees in connection with their responsibilities for the administration of public lands generally. And that was a reaction to the imperial presidency of Barack Obama, to the fact that he was using executive power to try to deal with some issues on public lands and others. It was also the issue today, and I think Mr. Huffman said really importantly, is the elephant in the room. Somebody said anger at Trump. I don't have any anger at Trump. Somebody said distaste for Trump. That I can plead guilty to. But I think what I think it's really important that I have to express the reason why this subpoena resolution is important. This committee, regardless of who's in power, cannot be an inconvenience to whatever administration happens to be in power. And time again, an inconvenience. And we've never confronted an administration like the Trump administration that sees the role of this branch of government as irrelevant and inconvenient. And they want to, in their own imperial style, do what they want without any checks, without any balances, and without any oversight. And that is a dangerous path. And if anything else, if we can contribute to affirming the role of this Congress and this committee in relationship to our representative government, then the subpoena is not only important, it's necessary, because we are on a dangerous path. And the way to turn that path around is for us to affirm who we are, why people elected us, and why this branch of government is a co-equal branch, and as such, full oversight and full ability to access information, and when information is not given to us readily or cooperatively or in consultation, to have the ability legally to compel that information. That's why we're seeking this resolution, and that is why it's vital that all of us, irrespective of party, support and affirm what this Congress's role is historically and what it needs to be in the future, regardless of the dangerous path that this administration has taken this country and trying to making our Congress irrelevant. And I don't want to be irrelevant. I wasn't elected to be irrelevant, and we need to affirm that.
Mr.
14
Chairman,
months
I
later, we're
call
here,
the question.
and I think we need to take that vote.
Will the gentleman yield for a quick question?
I move to call the question, Mr. Chairman.
Second. Question being called? Before we, there's no more amendments, right? There's no further debate. Question being called. Ranking Member Bishop, you have the First Amendment designated as number 1, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Has that been sent out? Yes. Can you pass out all of them, please? Mr. Chairman, do you have them all passed out so we can save time?
Okay.
All right. As you're getting this amendment, let me go through. First of all, I'm going to use the first part of my speech to actually comment about the last 2 speeches I've heard. There is no freaking elephant in the room. If the majority thinks it was easy for us to get information from Sally Jewell, you're crazy. The issue is not the quality of the information that is received by us. We can't control that whether you want to or not. The issue in this amendment is the process and procedure we use. Are you going to do it with the vote of everyone here in the light of day, or will you have the ability of doing subpoenas without telling anybody about it? That's the only issue. Whether you like the information or not is not the issue. Whether you like this administration or the last administration or not is not the issue. The issue is the process we go through for subpoenas. Now, with that, I'm appreciative of what the chairman has been able to do in this amendment. We've reached an agreement, I believe,
yes,
that we both agree that this provides a modicum of information so that there will be a timeline. If a chairman wants to do a subpoena without having a vote ahead of it, there will be a timeline in which the information will then go to all members. And there is not only what we will do is if there's a majority that wants to have a vote and bring this publicly, it will be able to happen. There's also a House rule that allows this too, so we have this possibility. So I want to say, as much as this is a frustrating process that he didn't need and that we didn't need and you guys don't need, at least the chairman has agreed to come up with some procedural here, some guidelines, some guide rails, minimal I admit, but at least there are some guide rails for this process. So I appreciate, and I have to acknowledge, I appreciate Mr. Grijalva sitting down and looking at some of the language we proposed and coming back with this language, which I accept, and this is the First Amendment, and I think we can do this quickly. It has nothing to do with the quality of the information we may or may not be getting in the future. It's all about the process and the procedures.
Any further discussion of the amendment? And as the ranking member indicated, this is an amendment that I'm comfortable with and I support. If there's no further discussion, the question on this amendment amendment number 1, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Representative Johnson, you have the next amendment designated as number 2, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. The reason our current rules require votes by the members of this committee before the issuance of a subpoena is because subpoenas are, as we've discussed this morning, powerful investigatory and oversight tools. And that's why we ought to think hard about not just what we are issuing subpoenas for, but to whom we are issuing the subpoenas. There's a big difference between issuing subpoenas for documents versus the people themselves, and there's an even more significant difference in issuing subpoenas against government entities versus private citizens. Like the majority's hearing memo outlines, most of our oversight work has been applicable to federal agencies and may even involve federal officials. The problem with the resolution as drafted, however, and this has been pointed out a couple times already this morning, is that it fails to provide a distinction between government entities and private citizens who could be subject to unilateral subpoenas lodged by the chairman. As some of my colleagues have explained, with this newfound power, the chairman could drag up to this committee anybody, from a small-town Alaskan fisherman to a private rancher in Arizona, to even employees of small, mid-sized, or larger companies or nonprofits, with absolutely no discussion or vote by the members of this committee. The people we are talking about here are the constituents in our own communities and districts, and the resolution leaves every one of our constituents vulnerable to the unchecked power of a chairman and potentially any future chairman of this committee if the rule stands. The legal costs associated with having to hire representation when an individual is subpoenaed could become exorbitant for the private citizen who doesn't have the luxury of an agency or government lawyer representing them to protect them from congressional overreach. Private citizens shouldn't live in fear that the Congress that they elected to work for them is going to bludgeon them with powers it gives itself to even potentially destroy their lives. And that's not an overstatement. This resolution makes private citizens vulnerable, and we can rectify that concern very simply by just exempting private citizens from the chairman's unilateral authority, at least, and requiring a public vote on such subpoenas. With that, I yield back.
Any further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. Well, there are no current plans to subpoena private citizens. The investigative process needs to be flexible and should not exclude whole categories of people. This amendment would seriously undermine the committee's ability to work with private parties to obtain information voluntarily. Why would a private entity bother cooperating with a request if the committee has publicly announced that we do not have existing subpoena authority for that person? This amendment would also create a bizarre incentive for bad actors in the administration with something to hide to just resign when they see the writing on the wall. The chair has already demonstrated a commitment to working with different parties to make reasonable accommodations when possible. Issuing a subpoena is the last resort that will only be needed if there is a substantial obstruction occurring. Under the consultation amendment adopted today, members of the committee will know who the recipient is 7 days before a subpoena goes out. The chair remains committed to hearing out any concerns during that period. I would also ask my Republican colleagues to honestly consider whether they would accept a limit on the chair's ability to subpoena the leaders of environmental organizations if the chair was a Republican. I doubt that would be something that would be acceptable to them. 2/3 of the House committees already give the chair subpoena authority without requiring a vote, including private entities. We're only seeking the same authority that they already have. And with that, I would urge a no vote. Anyone else wish to? Mr. Gosar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak in favor of this amendment. In this resolution, the chair has granted unilateral authority to subpoena federal agencies and private citizens. The chair will be able to bring the full weight of a congressional subpoena against a private citizen without a vote by the members of this committee. This is a power ripe for abuse. The chair will be able to issue a subpoena to any private citizen, even if the sole reason is that that individual advocates for views that are in opposition to the chair. By granting the subpoena authority, private individuals will be subject to harassment at the authority of this committee simply based on the chair's sole discretion. Private citizens will be subject to one of the most coercive tools this committee can use. It is a tool that may be used too aggressively to silence the voices of private citizens and the minority. It turns into a David versus Goliath situation. the lone citizen versus the power of this committee. A private citizen does not have the resources the executive branch agencies have to defend themselves. They do not have the access to the same funds as the availability of the vast legal expertise. Trying to navigate through the subpoena process would cause unspeakable financial hardships to private citizens. This is simply wrong. I urge the committee to adopt this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
To be heard?
Chairman.
Mr. Lamborn?
Just real quickly, the example you gave, Mr. Chairman, doesn't really apply. You said someone could be exempt from subpoenas if they resigned and became a private citizen. Well, then the resort would be doing a committee subpoena. You have that available right now. Both parties have had that available in the past. So there is no exemption for somebody. It's just that you do the current process. So this is totally, this whole thing we're doing here today is totally needless. You still have, you have subpoena power already. And I don't know why you have to have this additional ripe for abuse subpoena power, as Mr. Gosar said.
Mr. Lamborn, will you yield? Over here.
And I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman who offered the amendment, Mr. Johnson.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, to address your concern, and that may be valid, if the concern is, as Mr. Lamborn just articulated, that someone would resign their office and thus be exempt, even if that scenario were true, then what if we just added a few additional words to this amendment, where it says, except that this authority shall not apply to any records or testimony from private citizens not currently, what if we added there, and not within the previous year, an officer, official, or employee of any agency or component entity of the department, et cetera. That would seem to resolve your concern that this is not a duck and hide scenario. That's certainly not the intent of the amendment, and that would resolve that, and maybe we could all agree on it. If we just added that simple phrase after the word currently, and not within the previous year, an officer, et cetera. What do you think about that?
One of the concerns, but the stated opposition remains to the amendment.
I tried. I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized in the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the Johnson Amendment number 2, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. And as per prior recorded vote, it's been requested. As per prior announcement, that postponed. Let's vote on the amendment now. Voting is open. Members, please record your votes. Johnson Amendment number 2. One person talk to me. I don't. As every member, okay. Has every member recorded their vote? If so, clerk will report. Vote is now closed. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 21.
The amendment is not accepted. Amendment number 4, Representative.
I had an amendment number 3.
These are the filed amendments that were on record. That's why I'm going to forward this.
Oh, so I'll, okay.
Representative Fulcher, you have amendment number 4, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when a chairman has subpoena authority, then sometimes there could be a scenario that comes to bear where those of us on the committee could effectively hide from taking a vote, specifically a vote on who might get subpoenaed or not. I just think that that's part of our job. That's why we got elected. That's what we're supposed to do. That's one reason, the primary reason for this amendment offering. I will say, without going into detail, I got an earful from some of my constituents on some actions that the chairman has taken with an investigation of a project in my state. I'm not going to go into that, but that's another concern that I've got. But this amendment has some precedent, and basically it takes a page out of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. What this amendment would do is it would replace the text of the resolution with the subpoena rule of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and it would allow the chair to issue a subpoena if the ranking member concurs, or if there's an affirmative vote by the majority of the entire committee. So it strengthens that capacity, but it makes it more fair. And I'm not going to repeat all the points that my colleagues have made, but I just urge the committee to consider that. Once again, the amendment would allow the chair to issue a subpoena if the ranking member concurs or if there's an affirmative vote by the majority of the entire committee. And that's what happens across the campus on the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. Committee members, it's reasonable, it's fair, it's accessible, it's not that hard to do, there's precedent for it. It's certainly more acceptable to the current minority, and to reference Mr. McClintock's statement, I think it's going to be more acceptable to the current majority at a future time if and when that majority switches parties. Urge the committee's support on this amendment number 4. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
To be recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to emphasize how critically important bipartisanship is in our role of oversight investigations. And with this amendment, it essentially takes that off the table because it says with the agreement of the ranking member or when authorized by a majority of the members of the committee. So what happens then is it cancels out the will of the minority. And in oversight investigations, the strength of this committee should be in a bipartisan effort on oversight investigations. And we know there are examples of where bipartisan investigations have yielded very strong findings and also offered potential solutions. If you look at that, you see the alleged human rights abuses by the World Wildlife Fund's eco-guards. And because this investigation was bipartisan, we were able to find documents of a wide range of both parties involved, and that would not have happened if we had this amendment in place at the time. In fact, this committee helped initiate a bipartisan investigation by GAO, and the report, which is going to help Congress continue to pursue its investigations, was a result of bipartisanship. When you place the or in here, it seems like you engage the minority, but indeed it doesn't, because it says you can use one or the other instead of both. And I would argue that at some point when the majority is turned, you all are going to want the ability to have a voice in these efforts, and it's going to be more powerful if it's bipartisan. Think about this. How people look at this committee outside of this committee is how are they doing things in a bipartisan manner? If there is a finding from this committee upon investigations that something is happening and it's a bipartisan finding, it is much, much stronger than if it is just a partisan finding. So why wouldn't we want to make sure that we have some conduit to have agreement to where we can actually work in a bipartisan way? This place is too partisan as it is. Why would we want to make it even more partisan This amendment drives us further apart instead of saying, hey, in oversight and investigations, in our role under Article 1, we should all be on the same page. We should all have a common thought in mind to make sure that we are looking out after the best interests of the resources of this nation, and that is a bipartisan effort. This amendment does not allow us to do that. This amendment specifically cancels out whatever good ideas come from the minority. And I would argue to you that we do have some good ideas over here. We may not always disagree, but why cancel out the good ideas that come from this side? Why not have a conduit to actually encourage those good ideas and say, listen, we can go through, have a lively debate, and whatever ones are decided upon should come to the surface. This doesn't allow us to do that. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we vote against this amendment, either that or take out the word or and put in the word and. And with that, I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be recognized in the amendment? The vote today on the final outcome of the resolution dealing with subpoenas is doing exactly that. Is the majority is entrusting the chair with that subpoena power. I don't think that action negates any effort to work in a bipartisan way to get information and to at all. And in fact, the safeguard that was approved under Mr. Bishop continues to involve the majority of these members in decisions that they do not support, and they have the means to bring an end to a particular subpoena via a majority vote. I'm not surprised that the Senate would adopt poorly drafted rules that are confusing and open to a lot of interpretations. I'm just surprised the sponsor would try to import these rules into the House. This amendment would just lead to more confusion, infighting, just like the Senate, and in an effort to try to keep us as bipartisan and as calm as possible, I think we should reject it. This has no place in the House. And with that, I urge a no vote on amendment number 4. Mr. Lambert.
Mr. Chairman, I yield briefly to the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify that my position on this is to vote
in the affirmative.
in the affirmative. This is, I think, an opportunity for us to find that bipartisan and only vote in favor of it if the word "and" were to be added.
I yield back.
Would anyone else wish to be recognized in the amendment? Not. If there's no further debate, all those in favor of amendment number 4 indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed.
Roll call vote, please, Mr. Chairman.
Roll call being requested. Members will please, voting is now open, will please record their votes. Armed Forces Services to your staff, about this. They want to incorporate it. Yeah. Has every member recorded their vote? If so, voting is closed and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 15 and the nays are 21.
The nays have it, and the amendment fails. Any further amendments on the resolution? Mr. Gosar, you are recognized for your amendment number
3.
Number 1.
Number 1? Okay. Mr. Chairman, I offer this amendment to ensure that the private citizens that will be targeted by subpoenas from this committee without a committee vote will have the option to pursue recompense from the federal government. The majority has made it clear they refuse to limit the ability of the chairman to target private citizens without a committee vote. The Equal Access to Justice Act was established to grant private citizens the ability to face up against the wrath of the powerful federal government. In recent years, it has been badly abused by massive special interest groups to loot the federal government. However, it can still serve its purpose in defending the individual. In this case, it can provide the ranchers or farmers in California, the miners in Arizona, or any other private citizen that may be targeted of this majority or any future majority by these new subpoena authority with some protection. The language is very simple. If a private citizen is served by a subpoena not directly authorized by an affirmative vote of this committee, they can seek compensation under the EJF format. If we're going to set the chairman on a subpoena rampage or not tying his hands with the citizens, we should allow the people the right to be not to be bankrupted by this action. This actually has an Arizona flavor. This was actually a law that was actually started by Senator DeConcini, and it is based upon the individual having to defend themselves against the full wrath of the federal government. I think this is an easy ask. I think it's a simple ask, and it covers the basis for the individual. With that, I ask all my colleagues to vote in the affirmative of that, and I yield back.
Any other member? Doesn't change the law as I understand it, Mr. Gosa? It doesn't change the law as it exists. And I appreciate it, and I support the amendment. Before embarking on any rampage, Mr. Gosar, I will. I don't want to be abusing any poor individual, and
Too late.
And more importantly, you know, I'm appreciative of you supporting the law. There's been debate on this committee in the past that we should get rid of it, and so it is coming to the light is a very important thing today, Mr. Gosar, and I appreciate it. With that, all those in favor of the amendment, Mr. Gosar, number 1, indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman. So there was something in the magic last night with Mr. Gallego over there on with Celebration to Pastor. So he foretold this.
If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting and agreeing to the resolution as amended. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed saying no. No. In the opinion of chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the roll call is being requested, a recorded vote, and members will record their votes. Voting is now open. I almost voted no. I saw that.
Hold on. 1 second.
Russia.
And the motion passes unanimously. Please, the members, please record their votes. I'm going to give you unfinished business when this is over. Both of you. It does read it.
Well, you don't.
Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 15.
The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted and agreed to as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question is now on adopting H.R. 5316 and ordering favorable reported to the House. A recorded vote being requested. The members will and that is Move Water Now Act by Mr. Cox. This is the one that we're voting on, 5316. Members will please record their votes.
First Cox.
We passed the other one by voice. Has every member voted?
Mr. Gomer has.
We're done.
Is every member having voted, the vote is now closed, and the clerk would please report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 15.
The ayes have it, and the legislation is ordered favorably reported to the House. And the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Now we have, the question is on adopting H.R. 1904, the Indian Water Rights Settlement Extension Act. All those in favor, a recorded vote having been requested, members will please record their votes. Where's the thing where it ends with the, no. Did I get it? Has every member voted? Voting is closed. Would the clerk please report?
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 22 and the nays are 14.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended to the House, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Now we're almost to the end. With the cooperation of the ranking member Bishop and other members of the committee, it appears that we have worked out an agreement on 3 bills scheduled for markup today. Before we begin, does any member have to seek time to speak on any of the bills and the unanimous consent package? Mr. Gosar, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak on the unanimous consent package. H.R. 4444 is a bipartisan piece of legislation that passed this committee and the full House last Congress. Simply put, this bill is about creating good governance and making sure taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately.
Mr. Chairman, the committee's not in order.
Has it ever been?
Committee's not in order.
Has it ever been in order?
Mr. Gosar, please continue, sir.
Simply put, this bill is about creating good governance and making sure taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately. This legislation simply establishes a pilot program to allow for more detailed understanding of how the Western Area Power Authority, or WAPA, speaks both taxpayer and how they spend taxpayer and ratepayers' dollars. This bill is the result of calls from some of the WAPA customers given rate increasing trends and other financial discrepancies. H.R. 4444 requires WAPA to develop a publicly available website that contains a detailed accounting of its rates, expenditures, staffing, and other operational and financial dealings. Since cost increases are ultimately borne by its customers, WAPA needs to be more transparent about its business practice. That is exactly what this bill seeks to achieve. As one of the agency's consumers told me, WAPA has a Visa card with no credit limit, and we can't see the receipt. I would like to ask unanimous consent to have this letter of support from the Grand Canyon State Electrical Cooperative Association submitted in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
With that, I thank the chairman for including this legislation in this markup. Thank the chairman and the ranking member for allowing it to be passed by unanimous consent. And I think by the detail 4444, it should have some magic to it. So with that, I yield back and thanks.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and as in the last session, we hope this legislation gets all the way through this time. It's a good piece of legislation and a bipartisan bill that a lot of people support, and particularly in our neck of the woods. With any other members wish to be recognized on the unanimous consent pieces of legislation? If not, I'll make a single UC motion to discharge the agreed upon bills. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 644. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4444. And I ask unanimous consent the Subcommittee of Indigenous Peoples of the United States be discharged from further consideration of S. 832, and without objection, so ordered. Now I ask unanimous consent that the following bills be adopted and ordered favorably reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 644 with an ANS offered by Ranking Member Bishop, H.R. 4444, and S. 832 without objection, so ordered, and without objections, the motions to reconsider are laid on the table. All members will have 2 days in which to file supplemental, additional, minority, or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the legislation ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. And I also ask unanimous consent that any bill ordered reported today with amendments, that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted in committee without objection. So ordered. I want to thank Mr. Bishop and other members of the committee for helping move the markup along. And some irony in that comment. And there's no further business. Committee's adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank the chair, the ranking member.